Her tiny hands were shaking as she tugged at the stranger's sleeve. Tears streaked down her face, her voice breaking with every word. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The room fell silent. Glasses clinked to a stop. Every eye turned. But the man she had chosen to beg was no ordinary stranger. He was the most feared Mafia boss in the city. And what he did next, no one in that room would ever forget. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It's a cold Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, 1987. The Golden Palm restaurant buzzed with the usual crowd of well-dressed men conducting business over expensive wine and hushed conversations. This wasn't just any restaurant. This was Vincent Torino's domain. Every waiter knew to keep their ears closed and their mouths shut. Every patron understood the unspoken rules. You minded your own business, you paid your respects, and you never, ever caused a scene. Vincent Torino sat at his usual corner table, a mountain of a man whose very presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. At 53, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 states. His dark eyes missed nothing. His word was law. And tonight, like every Tuesday for the past 15 years, he was conducting the weekly meeting with his lieutenants. The conversation flowed in low, measured tones. Numbers were discussed. Territories were divided. Problems were addressed with surgical precision. This was how Vincent operated. Methodical, calculated, without emotion clouding judgment. He had survived in this business longer than most because he understood one fundamental truth. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness got you killed. But then something happened that would shatter the carefully constructed walls Vincent had built around his heart. The restaurant's heavy oak door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Every head turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The maitre d' rushed forward, his face pale with panic. But before he could intercept the intruder, everyone saw what had caused the commotion. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood trembling in the doorway. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Blood stained her small white dress. Her dark hair hung in tangled knots around a face streaked with tears and grime. She looked like she had run through hell itself to get here. The child's eyes swept the room desperately, searching for something, someone, anyone who might help her. The restaurant's patrons stared back in stunned silence. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the intrusion. Others whispered among themselves, annoyed that their evening had been disrupted by what they assumed was some street orphan looking for handouts. But the little girl wasn't looking for money. She was looking for salvation. Her gaze landed on Vincent Torino's table, and something in those innocent brown eyes recognized power when she saw it. Maybe it was the way the other men deferred to him. Maybe it was the expensive suit or the gold watch that caught the light. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. A child's instinct recognizing the one person in that room who could actually do something. Without hesitation, she ran straight toward him. The room held its collective breath. Vincent's bodyguards tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their jackets. This was unprecedented. No one approached Vincent Torino uninvited, especially not like this. But before anyone could react, the little girl reached Vincent's table and grabbed his sleeve with both hands. Her tiny fingers clutched the expensive fabric as if it were a lifeline. And then she spoke those words that would echo in Vincent's mind for the rest of his life. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that restaurant. Every eye was on Vincent, waiting to see how the notorious crime boss would handle this unprecedented situation. His reputation was built on being untouchable, unfeeling, a man who showed mercy to no one. Vincent looked down at the child clinging to his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, those brown eyes wide with desperation and hope. In that moment, something shifted in the hardened criminal's chest, something he hadn't felt in decades. You see, Vincent Torino hadn't always been the cold, calculating crime boss that Chicago feared. Once upon a time, he had been a different man, a man who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. 30 years earlier, Vincent had been married to a woman named Maria. She was the light of his world, the only person who could make him laugh, who could soften the edges that life had sharpened. They had dreams of starting a family, of building something beautiful together despite the ugly world Vincent operated in. But those dreams were shattered one night when a rival family decided to send Vincent a message. They didn't come for him directly. That would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, they went after the one thing they knew would destroy him more completely than any bullet or bomb ever could. They went after Maria. Vincent came home that night to find his world torn apart. His wife, his future, his heart, all of it gone in an instant. The investigation went nowhere. The police asked questions they already knew they'd never get answers to. And Vincent learned the hardest lesson of his life. In his world, love was a liability that could be exploited by anyone ruthless enough to target it. From that night forward, Vincent Torino built walls around his heart that no one could penetrate. He became ruthless because ruthlessness was survival. He became feared because fear was respect. And he became alone because alone meant no one else could be used against him. For 3 decades, those walls had held firm. No amount of pleading, threatening, or bribing had ever made Vincent Torino show mercy when mercy wasn't profitable. He had ordered hits on men who begged for their lives. He had foreclosed on businesses while owners wept at his feet. He had sent fathers to prison while their children cried in courtrooms. But now, looking down at this little girl who reminded him so painfully of the children he and Maria had dreamed of having, those walls began to crack. The child's grip tightened on his sleeve. Her voice came out in broken sobs as she tried to explain what had happened. Through her tears, Vincent began to piece together a story that made his blood run cold. The little girl's name was Sophie. Her mother, Elena, worked at a small flower shop on the south side of the city. They lived in a tiny apartment above the shop, just the two of them trying to make an honest living in a neighborhood where honest livings were hard to come by. But their neighborhood was also territory disputed by 2 rival gangs, both of whom demanded protection money from local businesses. Elena had been caught in the middle, unable to pay both sides, unwilling to choose between them. And tonight, that impossible situation had finally exploded into violence. Sophie's words came out in a rush, punctuated by hiccups and sobs. She described how the men had come to the shop after closing time, how they had demanded money her mother didn't have, how the situation had escalated when Elena tried to protect the little bit of cash they needed for rent and groceries. And then Sophie described something that made even Vincent's hardened associates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The men had beaten her mother unconscious and left her bleeding on the floor of the flower shop. Sophie had hidden behind the counter, watching in terror as they ransacked the place, destroying everything her mother had worked so hard to build. When they finally left, laughing about teaching the neighborhood a lesson, Sophie had crawled out to find her mother barely breathing. "I tried to wake her up," Sophie whispered, her small voice cracking. "But she won't open her eyes. There's so much blood." The restaurant remained frozen in that moment. Vincent's lieutenants exchanged glances, unsure how their boss would respond to this unprecedented interruption. Some of the other patrons had begun to whisper among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. But Vincent Torino wasn't thinking about his reputation or his image. He wasn't calculating the business implications of getting involved in what was clearly gang violence on someone else's territory. For the first time in 30 years, Vincent was thinking with his heart instead of his head. He looked down at Sophie, this brave little girl who had somehow found the courage to burst into the most dangerous restaurant in Chicago and approach the most feared man in the room. She could have gone to the police, could have called an ambulance, could have run to neighbors or relatives. Instead, she had chosen him. A child's desperate instinct had led her straight to the one person who had the power and resources to actually make a difference. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Vincent asked, his voice gentler than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "Sophie," she managed between sobs. "Sophie Martinez." Vincent nodded slowly, then looked up at his bodyguard, Tony Russo. "Get the car," he said quietly. "Now." Tony hesitated for just a moment. In all his years working for Vincent, he had never seen his boss make a decision this impulsive, this emotional. "Boss, maybe we should—" "I said get the car." Vincent's tone carried just enough steel to remind everyone that despite the unusual circumstances, he was still very much in charge. As Tony hurried toward the exit, Vincent turned his attention back to Sophie. With surprising gentleness for a man his size, he knelt down beside her chair so they were at eye level. His massive frame dwarfed the tiny girl, but somehow his presence seemed to comfort rather than intimidate her. "Sophie, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Vincent said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm going to help your mama, but first I need you to tell me exactly what these men looked like. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded eagerly, relief flooding her features at the promise of help. Through her tears, she began to describe the attackers. 2 men, both young, both wearing red bandanas. One had a scar running down his left cheek. The other had a spider tattoo on his neck. They had called each other by names, Carlos and Miguel. Vincent's expression darkened as he listened. He recognized the descriptions immediately. Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos, mid-level enforcers for the Red Serpents, a gang that had been trying to muscle in on territory that had been neutral ground for over a decade. They were known for their brutality, their willingness to hurt innocent people to make their point. But what they had done tonight was different. What they had done tonight was personal. Vincent stood up, his decision made. "Marco," he called to one of his lieutenants, "call Dr. Chen. Tell him to meet us at General Hospital with everything he needs for emergency surgery. Tell him it's a priority case." Marco nodded and immediately pulled out his phone. Dr. Chen was one of the city's best trauma surgeons, and he owed Vincent more favors than he could count. If anyone could save Sophie's mother, it would be him. "Sal," Vincent continued, addressing another of his men, "I want you to find Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos. Bring them to the warehouse on 5th Street, alive. I want to have a conversation with them about their business practices." Sal smiled and Pre was coldatory. "Consider it done, boss." Vincent looked around the restaurant one more time, taking in the shocked faces of his associates and the other patrons. He knew this moment would be talked about for years to come. The night Vincent Torino showed mercy, the night the ice-cold crime boss let a little girl melt his heart. But he didn't care about any of that anymore. All he cared about was the small hand that slipped into his, as Sophie looked up at him with complete trust. "Is my mama going to be okay?" she asked in a tiny voice. Vincent squeezed her hand gently. "I'm going to make sure she is," he promised. And Vincent Torino never made promises he couldn't keep. The ride to the flower shop took 12 minutes through the crowded Chicago streets. Vincent sat in the back of his black sedan with Sophie beside him, her small body finally relaxing for the first time in hours. She had stopped crying, though her eyes remained wide and watchful. Every few seconds, she would look up at Vincent, as if making sure he was still there, still committed to helping her. Tony drove with the skill of a man who had navigated Chicago's streets under pressure many times before. Behind them, 2 more cars followed, one carrying Dr. Chen and his medical equipment, the other filled with Vincent's most trusted men. As they pulled up to the flower shop, Vincent could see the devastation immediately. The front window had been smashed. Flowers and plants lay scattered across the sidewalk, their petals crushed underfoot. The sign that had once proudly displayed Elena's flowers hung crooked and damaged. But Vincent's attention was focused on what lay inside. Sophie's grip tightened on Vincent's hand as they stepped out of the car. The cold night air carried the scent of crushed roses and broken dreams. Through the shattered storefront, they could see a figure lying motionless on the floor among scattered flower petals and overturned displays. Elena Martinez lay crumpled behind the counter. Her dark hair fanned across the wooden floor like spilled ink. Blood pooled beneath her head, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Vincent had seen enough violence in his lifetime to know she was fading fast. Dr. Chen rushed past them, his medical bag already open. He knelt beside Elena, his practiced hands moving quickly to assess her injuries. Severe head trauma, he muttered, checking her pulse. Possible internal bleeding. We need to move her now. Vincent watched as the doctor worked, but his attention was divided. Sophie stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame trembling as she took in the destruction of everything she knew. Her home, her mother's life's work. All of it lay in ruins around them. Sophie, listen to me, Vincent said, crouching down to meet her eyes. The doctor is going to take care of your mama, but I need you to stay strong for her, okay? The little girl nodded, though tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Will she remember me when she wakes up? The question hit Vincent harder than any bullet ever had. He thought of Maria, of all the things left unsaid, all the moments stolen by violence. She'll remember, he said firmly, and she'll be so proud of how brave you were tonight. As the paramedics loaded Elena onto a stretcher, Vincent's phone buzzed. Sal's voice came through crisp and efficient. Boss, we found them. Carlos and Miguel were at a bar on Ashland, bragging about their work tonight. They're secured at the warehouse. Vincent's jaw tightened. The rage that had been simmering beneath his protective instincts began to surface. These weren't just random criminals anymore. They were the men who had put a 7-year-old girl through hell. They were the reason Elena Martinez might never see another sunrise. Good, Vincent replied, his voice deadly calm. I'll be there after I get Sophie settled. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and Sophie's whispered prayers. Vincent found himself holding the little girl's hand as she spoke to her unconscious mother, telling her about the nice man who was going to help them, promising to be good if she would just wake up. At the hospital, Dr. Chen disappeared into surgery while Vincent made arrangements. Sophie would stay in a private room adjacent to her mother's. Round-the-clock security, the best pediatric care available. Money was no object when it came to keeping this child safe, but as Vincent tucked Sophie into the hospital bed, he knew his night was far from over. The little girl had fallen asleep, clutching a stuffed bear one of the nurses had brought her. Exhaustion finally claiming her small body. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, so from the broken, different child who had stumbled into his restaurant hours earlier. Vincent stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone. Bring Tony the car around. It's time to visit our guests. The warehouse on 5th Street was one of Vincent's more discreet properties. No neighbors to hear sounds, no windows for light to escape, just thick concrete walls and the kind of privacy that allowed for serious conversations. Carlos Vega and Miguel Santos sat tied to chairs in the center of the empty space, their earlier bravado replaced by the kind of fear that came with recognizing your situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. Both men were young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of swagger that came from thinking violence made you untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Vincent entered the warehouse slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He had changed from his dinner suit into darker clothes, but his presence filled the room just as completely. Behind him, Tony and Sal took positions by the door. Gentlemen, Vincent said, his voice conversational. I understand you had a busy evening. Carlos, the one with the scar, tried to maintain his defiance. Look, man, whatever this is about, we can work something out. You know how it is in our business. Vincent walked a slow circle around the two chairs, studying his captives like specimens under a microscope. Our business, he repeated. Tell me, Carlos, what business do you think beating unconscious mothers in front of their children falls under? The color drained from Carlos's face. Miguel, the one with the spider tattoo, began to sweat visibly. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about territory or money or any of the usual reasons men in their line of work found themselves in situations like this. The woman was holding out on us, Miguel stammered. She owed protection money. We had to make an example. Vincent stopped walking. The temperature degrees, and in the room seemed to drop 10 example, he saily. And what example did soft you think you were making when you traumatized a 7-year-old girl? Neither man answered. They couldn't, because there was no answer that would save them now. Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture Sophie had drawn while waiting at the hospital, a crayon sketch of her mother surrounded by flowers. The little girl had given it to him, asking him to keep it safe until her mama could see it. "This is Sophie Martinez," Vincent said, holding up the drawing. 7 years old, loves butterflies and chocolate ice cream, dreams of becoming a teacher so she can help other children learn to read. Tonight, she watched 2 grown men beat her mother unconscious over $67. He set the drawing on a nearby table where both men could see it. $67, he repeated. That's what Elena Martinez had in her register. Barely enough to cover tomorrow's grocery run. And you two thought it was worth putting a child through hell to take it. Carlos made one last desperate attempt at negotiation. "Look, Mr. Torino, we didn't know the kid was there. If we had known..." "If you had known what?" Vincent's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "If you had known. You would have beaten her too? Made sure there were no witnesses to your heroic victory? A single-over mother trying to make an honest living?" Vincent walked to the table where his men had laid out various tools. Not weapons exactly, but implements that could become very persuasive in the right hands. He selected a pair of heavy pliers, testing their grip thoughtfully. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly intent behind his words. "You're going to tell me exactly how much money your little gang has made from terrorizing shop owners in Elena's neighborhood. Every dollar, every cent. And then you're going to help me figure out how to make sure it gets distributed back to the people you've been bleeding dry." Miguel's voice cracked as he spoke. "We don't have that kind of authority. The money goes up the chain. We just collect." Vincent nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Then it sounds like I need to have a conversation with your boss as well. What's his name?" "Razor Rodriguez," Carlos whispered. "But you can't touch him. He's got connections. Protection." Vincent actually smiled at this, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Protection," he mused. "You mean like the protection you offered Elena Martinez? The kind that involves unconscious mothers and traumatized children?" He set the pliers back on the table and picked up his phone instead. "Tony, I want you to arrange a meeting with this Razor Rodriguez. Tonight, if possible. Let him know that Vincent Torino would like to discuss his organization's customer service practices." As Tony made the call, Vincent turned back to his captives. "You see, gentlemen, I've been in this business for a very long time. I've made my share of enemies, taken my share of territory, collected my share of debts, but there are lines even men like us don't cross. And tonight, you crossed every single one of them." The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Miguel quietly sobbing. Carlos stared at the little girl's drawing on the table, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done. Vincent's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling from the hospital. "How is she?" Vincent answered immediately. "Touch and go," the doctor replied. "The next few hours will be critical, but she's a fighter. The surgery went better than expected." Vincent felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even realized was there. "And Sophie?" "Sleeping peacefully. She asked the nurses to tell you thank you for keeping your promise." After ending the call, Vincent looked at Carlos and Miguel with something approaching pity. "Elena Martinez is going to live," he told them, "which means you two just graduated from attempted murder to aggravated assault. Congratulations." He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "I want you to think very carefully about the choices you've made tonight. About the little girl who will have nightmares for months because of your actions. About the woman who will never feel completely safe in her own shop again. And then I want you to think about what kind of men you want to be when this is all over. Vincent left them there to contemplate their situation while he went to prepare for his meeting with Razor Rodriguez. The night was far from finished, but something fundamental had shifted in Vincent's world. For the first time in 30 years, he was fighting for something more than territory or respect or fear. He was fighting for the same thing that 7-year-old girl had fought for when she burst into his restaurant and grabbed his sleeve. He was fighting for family. The meeting with Razor Rodriguez was set for 2 in the morning at an abandoned auto shop on the industrial side of town. Vincent arrived with Tony and 3 other men, their black sedans cutting through the empty streets like shadows against the flickering streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and rust, a fitting backdrop for the kind of conversation that was about to unfold. Razor had brought his own crew, 6 men who tried to look intimidating but couldn't quite hide the nervousness in their eyes when Vincent stepped out of his car. Word traveled fast in their world, and by now everyone knew that Vincent Torino had personally involved himself in what should have been a minor neighborhood dispute. Razor Rodriguez was younger than Vincent had expected, maybe 35, with gold teeth and enough jewelry to stock a small pawn shop. He carried himself with the kind of artificial confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. Vincent recognized the type immediately. All flash, no substance. The kind of leader who sent others to do his dirty work while he counted money and made threats from a safe distance. "Mr. Torino," Razor said, extending a hand that Vincent ignored entirely. "This is unexpected. I heard you don't usually get involved in street-level business anymore." Vincent's silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. He studied Razor with the same intensity he might use to examine a particularly venomous snake, cataloging weaknesses, measuring threats, calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to break this man's carefully constructed image. "Street-level business," Vincent repeated finally, his voice carrying across the empty garage like distant thunder. "Is that what you call terrorizing mothers and traumatizing children?" Razor's smile faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his swagger. "Look, business is business. Sometimes people need reminders about their obligations. My boys might have gotten a little carried away, but—" "Your boys," Vincent interrupted, "put a 7-year-old girl through hell tonight. They beat her mother unconscious over $67. $67, Rodriguez." The temperature in the garage seemed to drop. Vincent's men had positioned themselves strategically around the space, and Razor's crew was beginning to realize that this meeting might not end with the usual handshake and territorial agreement they had expected. "The woman was behind on her payments," Razor said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. 3 months behind. We gave her plenty of warnings." Vincent took a step closer, and despite being surrounded by his own men, Razor instinctively backed away. There was something in Vincent's eyes that spoke of violence older and deeper than anything Razor had ever encountered, a kind of controlled fury that made the young gang leader's petty brutalities look like children playing at being monsters. 3 months, Vincent said thoughtfully. "Tell me, Rodriguez, do you know what Elena Martinez does for a living?" "She runs some flower shop," Razor replied, confusion evident in his voice. "She runs a flower shop that barely makes enough to cover rent and groceries. She works 16-hour days arranging bouquets for weddings she'll never afford to have, funeral wreaths for people she's never met, Valentine's arrangements for lovers who have what she lost when her husband died in a construction accident 3 years ago." Vincent's voice remained steady, but there was something building beneath the calm surface, like pressure in a boiler that was approaching its breaking point. "She's been behind on your blood money because she spent her last savings on medicine for Sophie when the girl had pneumonia last winter. She chose her daughter's life over your protection racket, and somehow you thought that made her fair game for your animals." Razor tried to interrupt, but Vincent continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Do you know what that little girl did tonight, Rodriguez? After she watched your men beat her mother unconscious, After she saw everything she knew destroyed, she didn't call the police. She didn't run to neighbors. She walked 12 blocks through the worst part of the city, a 7-year-old girl alone in the dark, to find someone who could help. Vincent pulled out Sophie's crayon drawing again, holding it up so everyone in the garage could see it. This is what courage looks like, Rodriguez. This is what real strength is. A child who refuses to give up on the person she loves most in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Razor's men seemed uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. Vincent folded the drawing carefully and placed it back in his jacket, right over his heart. "So here's what's going to happen," Vincent said, his tone shifting from philosophical to purely business. "You're going to liquidate your entire operation in Elena's neighborhood. Every protection payment, every debt, every outstanding balance, it all disappears tonight." Razor's artificial bravado flared back to life. "You can't just come in here and—" "I'm not done talking," Vincent said quietly, and the younger man's mouth snapped shut. "You're going to take whatever money you've collected from that neighborhood over the past year, and you're going to distribute it back to every shop owner, every family, every person you've been bleeding dry." "That's impossible. We don't have that kind of cash on hand. And even if we did, then you'll find it," Vincent replied. "Sell your cars, your jewelry, your mother's china if you have to. Rob your own dealers for all I care. But those people are getting their money back." Vincent walked closer until he was standing directly in front of Razor, close enough that the younger man had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "And if I hear about any of your people operating within 10 blocks of Elena's flower shop ever again, if so much as one of your boys jaywalks in her neighborhood, I will personally introduce you to the kind of consequences your parents should have taught you about years ago." 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood behind the counter of her rebuilt flower shop, watching through sparkling new windows as her daughter Sophie played in the small garden Vincent had installed behind the building. The red serpents had vanished from the neighborhood entirely, their former territories now under the quiet protection of men who understood the difference between power and bullying. Vincent still visited every Tuesday, not as the feared crime boss of Chicago, but as the man who had chosen to let a little girl's courage crack open his heart. Elena would prepare fresh coffee, Sophie would show him her latest drawings, and for a few precious hours, the three of them would sit together like the family none of them had dared to dream possible. The city whispered about the night Vincent Torino saved a child and found his soul. But Sophie knew the truth that the adults had missed entirely. She hadn't saved her mother by finding the most dangerous man in Chicago. She had saved him by showing him that even the hardest heart could choose love over fear. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power to change everything. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places.